Have you ever walked through a forest and felt like something was watching you? Strange footprints. Totems moved overnight. A stone carved with two haunting words. Why more? Mabel thought she was imagining things, until her son Eli found a wounded creature caught in a trap. It wasn't human, but it spoke, and it was terrified of us. The Bigfoot were never a myth. They once lived in harmony with the land and native tribes, until machines, greed, and chainsaws tore the forest apart. Now, their last sanctuary is about to fall, and a silent war is brewing between hope and extinction. This isn't just a fantasy. It's a mirror held up to our world. A story of children, guardians, and a fading species who risk everything to save what's left. So, where are you watching this from? What's your name, dear friend? And how far could this story travel if shared from your screen to someone else's heart? If this tale speaks to you, give it a like, subscribe, and help us grow a community that believes in protecting the unseen. From our forest to your home, thank you for being here. Late summer never really said goodbye in these mountains. It just softened, like a breath being held. The days were still warm, the air still sweet with pine sap and dry grass, but the forest was already preparing. Shadows a little longer, sunlight a little lower, birdsong turning just a shade more restless. Mabel Carver felt all of it, the way a person feels aches in old scars. Nothing moved in Elder Hollow without stirring something in her chest. She stepped out of the small ranger station she called home and locked the door behind her, though it no longer mattered. There was no one left who cared enough to steal from her. The building was a single-story cabin of weathered boards and a tin roof that rattled in the wind. It stood at the edge of the national forest like a forgotten outpost. Paint peeling, radio antenna bent slightly from winter storms. A coffee tin overflowing with wildflowers sat on the windowsill, the only bright thing she kept around. The early sun filtered through the trees in long columns of gold. Dust and pollen floated in the beams like confetti, celebrating a day that had not yet decided whether to be ordinary or not. Mabel adjusted her backpack, checked the small first aid pouch clipped to her belt, and started down the familiar path. Her boots made soft thuds against the earth, the forest floor springy underfoot with needles and moss. She knew every bend, every leaning cedar, every granite boulder that had held its place longer than any house humans would ever build. Most mornings were quiet. That was how she liked it. She didn't need conversations with people. She'd had enough of them to last a lifetime, and most of the time they only took something from her. Patience, belief, a piece of her heart. But the forest gave. Not loudly, not obviously, but in steadiness, in presence, in the understanding that even if you were broken, you still belonged somewhere. The radio on her shoulder crackled once, then went silent again. Good. She wasn't in the mood to be reminded of the world outside the trees. She walked toward the timberline-marked zone, a patch of land the logging company had insisted on twice during the year. She'd stalled it once with paperwork, bird migration, potential erosion, anything to buy the forest more time. But delays were not victories. She knew that. Mabel paused near a cluster of flagging tape in bright neon orange. Someone had hammered fresh wooden stakes into the ground since she was last here. Too many. Too deep into the trees. Anger flickered in her belly like a stove lighting. She touched one of the stakes with her glove, pushing slightly. Solid. The forest didn't like lines drawn on it. She felt that like a tension behind her rib cage. A breeze stirred the fir branches overhead, and something clacked against something else in a rhythm too deliberate for wind. She waited, breath held, listening. It stopped when she turned. Just cicadas now, buzzing in the tall grasses. She shook off the chill that crawled up her spine. Downhill, a small creek whispered over stones. The sunlight danced in scattered coins across the water. She crouched, letting her hand feel the coolness. A ripple, a flicker. Then she saw it. In the mud of the bank, a footprint. Not bear, not elk, 5 long toes. A deep arch. Pressure weight on the midfoot like something standing upright most of the time, but powerful enough to crush stone if it wanted. The size, Lord, the size of it. Nearly twice her boot length. Her pulse thudded heavy in her neck. She scanned for claw marks. There were none. A human would need feet like paddles to leave prints this big. She stood slowly, eyes narrowing at the tree line across the stream. Nothing but dark greens and shadows. For a moment, though, she could have sworn one of those shadows was breathing. "Great," she muttered to herself, forcing a steady exhale. "Just what I need." She grabbed a thin survey marker from her pack and stuck it near the footprint, scribbling a code on the plastic tag. Wolves or cougar, she understood. A tracker of 40 years didn't mistake those. But this was something that stirred old memories she had spent decades refusing to untangle. She turned back toward the marked logging stakes, trying to shove down the unease. Placing her hand against a rough pine trunk, she reminded herself that mystery didn't always mean danger. Sometimes the unknown was just the other half of a truth humans weren't ready to share. She returned to the ranger station near dusk, shoulders stiff from tension she hadn't noticed building all day. She made herself a sandwich from yesterday's bread and a slice of cheddar, ate standing by the counter while flipping through old incident reports. Nothing in there about footprints like that. Night settled quickly, chilling the air enough that she reached for her flannel jacket. She sat on the porch with a flashlight and her field notes, trying to make sense of what she saw by the creek. The woods across the dirt road were pitch black now, except for the thin outline of treetops cutting into a moonlit sky. Owls called from somewhere out there. She closed her eyes and tried to picture the footprint again. The weight distribution? The stride. What kind of bones were inside a foot like that? What muscles held it upright? She slept unevenly, dreams filled with rustling shapes she couldn't quite see. The morning brought a strange certainty with a first hint of gray light. She hurried back to the flagged zone before coffee, breath fogging faintly even though summer still clung to the land. The stakes she'd noted yesterday were no longer where she left them. They formed a curve now, a sweeping arc, pointing deeper into the forest. A direction, a decision. Mabel stopped dead. The air around her felt charged, like before lightning strikes. She scanned for boot tracks. Someone from the logging crew wanting to mess with her, maybe. But the dirt held no shape she recognized. Just the faint scuff of something heavy being dragged or placed with care. "Who are you?" she whispered. Then she noticed a rock near the base of a cedar. It looked ordinary enough at first, but the surface held scratches. Straight, deliberate marks. She knelt, brushing dirt away. Letters. Why more? The question punched through her chest in a rush of heat and fear. Animals did not ask questions. Animals did not carve messages into stone. Her throat tightened as she stood. The forest suddenly too silent. Not even the cicadas. Not even birds. The world was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do. She picked up a fallen branch and tapped it lightly against another rock, more to steady her shaking hands than anything. The sound echoed once. Sharp, clear. Something answered. 3 separate knocks, from 3 different spots among the trees. Perfectly timed, perfectly measured. A conversation, if she dared to think that way. Her heart hammered. She felt like a child discovering language for the first time. She tapped again, 2 beats this time. Responding knocks came back, moving slightly closer. It wasn't random. It wasn't wind or acorns or a deer kicking a tree. Someone was calling back. She backed up slowly, refusing to turn her back to whatever intelligence lurked between those trunks. She didn't know if she should run or bow or introduce herself like a polite neighbor. Every instinct buzzed with a warning. Do not break the connection, but do not challenge it either. By the time she made it home, her legs were trembling. She slammed the door and leaned against it, gulping air while her hands fumbled for the lock. She wasn't scared of the forest, or at least she never had been. She grew up in these trees, played in them, hid in them. Once, they had saved her. That memory flickered, something she rarely allowed into the light. She walked to the small box of photos she kept tucked under her bed. Old snapshots from a life when families were simpler and futures seemed guaranteed. She found the picture she remembered. Her, at 10 years old, hair wild, smiling too hard because the world felt friendly then. Behind her, at the edge of the woods, a shape, tall, broad, almost blending into the tree line. For years she told herself it was a shadow, a trick of light, a warped tree trunk. Adults made her believe imagination was the enemy of logic. But today, after footprints, after carved messages, after intelligent knocks, the denial tasted bitter. Someone had been watching her even then, not as a predator, no hostility, more like a guardian no one believed existed. Her hand covered her mouth as she stared at the photograph. A memory long buried pushed its way forward. The cliff near Elder Ridge, the crumbled ledge, her small hands clawing at dirt that gave way too easily, and a massive grip closing around her wrist, pulling her back to solid ground. She had never seen the face, but she remembered the feel. Warm, careful, strong enough to lift a girl as if she were no heavier than a pine cone. She never told anyone. They'd call it fantasy, trauma, a fall making a story out of nothing. Yet the forest had been saving her before she even knew what danger was. And maybe it never stopped. She sank into the worn armchair near the fireplace, the photo trembling slightly in her grasp as the late afternoon faded toward evening. The radio crackled again, but she ignored it. The sound of the forest knocking from earlier replayed in her mind, beating like some ancient language older than human greed. The window glass shivered gently with the cooling winds of night. She looked out. Nothing but silhouettes. But she could feel them, not threatening, not trying to invade her world. Just watching, just waiting. Her loneliness, a weight she had carried so long she forgot what lightness felt like, loosened slightly. Maybe she wasn't alone after all. Maybe someone, or something, had been keeping her safe in ways she didn't understand. But the question carved into stone would not leave her head. Why more? Why do humans keep taking until there is nothing left? She touched the wooden floor with her bare foot, grounding herself in the home she had sworn to protect. The forest did not speak in words, but the message was clear enough. There were boundaries here, rules written in roots and rivers, and someone was finally asking her to see them. She breathed deeply, feeling both comforted and terrified by the same truth. The forest remembered her. It always had. And now it wanted her to remember too. Outside, a single knock echoed faintly from the trees. Not demand, not threat. An invitation. The sun was gone now, leaving only the hush of night settling into every hollow of the land. Mabel closed her eyes, knowing sleep would not come easily. Not with footprints in the creek. Not with stakes rearranged into symbols. Not with questions carved into stone. There was someone out there. Someone who could move through the dark without fear. Someone who knew these woods deeper than any human map could show. Someone who had once saved her life and had never truly left her side. Whether guardian or warning, she didn't yet know. But as she sat alone with her heartbeat drumming in her ears, she felt it. The forest was watching back. And for the first time in many years, she didn't feel afraid of that. She felt seen. It was the kind of morning that made you believe the forest had secrets. Leaves had just begun to dry at the edges, their golden veins catching the first dappled light as it filtered through the thinning canopy. The air smelled of moss and cold bark and some deep, patient silence that only comes in the earliest days of fall. Every step Eli Martinez took off the trail was muffled by a carpet of pine needles. He didn't look back once. Not at the broken boards of the back fence he'd climbed through. Not at the dirt lot with the cracked basketball hoop where kids had tripped him. Not at the trailer where his mother and father were likely still yelling about money, blame, or whatever was left between them. He had packed a granola bar, 2 bottles of water, and an old windbreaker in his backpack. Enough. For now. Eli was 15, all elbows and unfinished strength, with dark curls that never sat right, and a sharpness in his jaw that made him look older than he felt. He didn't run away from home because he thought it was romantic. He ran because the forest was the only place that didn't echo with his own name shouted in anger or pity. The only place that hadn't yet let him down. He knew where he was going. Past the split oak with the lightning scar, down the slope behind the maintenance road, around the hollow where old tires had been dumped years ago, then further, deep enough that the sky began to narrow above him. There, behind the ridge, was a place most people never bothered to reach, a place Eli called the Den. It wasn't much, just a narrow cave nestled beneath a pile of ancient rock slabs. But it had once been a world. When he was 10, he spent a week there pretending to be a runaway prince. Now it was just a place to disappear without needing anyone to come looking. But that morning the den was not empty. He heard it before he saw it. A low, wet, rasping sound, like someone dragging breath through broken glass. Eli froze, heart thudding behind his ribs. He crouched slowly, ears straining. The sound came again, shallow, pained, and close. He edged forward, pulling his flashlight from his pack and clicking it on. The beam caught a flash of tangled fur, a shape curled against the far stone wall. It wasn't a bear. That was his first thought. The second came slower, colder. Whatever it was hurt. He crept closer, light trembling in his hand. The creature flinched as the beam touched it, curling tighter. Long arms. Coarse, matted fur the color of dead leaves. One leg was twisted oddly beneath it, a glint of rusted metal biting into the flesh just above the ankle. A trap. An old steel jaw, half buried in dirt and moss. Blood had soaked into the fur, dried and cracked. Eli dropped the light, the beam scattering across the rock. "Hey," he whispered, "it's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The creature blinked slowly, its eyes dark and wet, locked onto his. They weren't animal eyes, not wild, not stupid. They held pain and understanding. He set down his backpack and reached forward, careful, palms up. The creature didn't move. The trap was rusted and stiff, but the release was intact. Eli braced his foot and pushed with both hands. It groaned open. The creature jerked, then pulled its leg free with a sharp whimper. Eli backed away as it collapsed fully, chest heaving. He could see the blood now, a slow, weeping line from torn skin. His own hands were scraped raw, and one wrist had a line of red where the trap spring caught him. He sat on the cave floor, breathing hard. Then, the creature did something that stopped his thoughts completely. It crawled forward, slowly, painfully, and placed one long hand over his bleeding wrist. A low murmur came from its throat. Not a growl, not a groan. A word. "Hurt," it rasped. "Sorry." Eli's skin prickled as if the forest itself had held its breath. He looked down. The hand was warm, rough, trembling. The voice, though barely a whisper, was filled with something no animal ever had. It's okay," Eli said quietly. "I'm okay." He didn't ask what it was. He just let it rest beside him. And he stayed there, still as the rock, until the shaking in its limbs calmed. The wind shifted outside, scattering yellow leaves through the mouth of the cave. He unzipped his backpack, pulled out the granola bar, and broke it in half. Without a word, he offered a piece. The creature sniffed it, then took it with long fingers and ate slowly. Its teeth were flat, human-like. Its eyes never left Eli's face. They sat like that for hours, two runaways sharing silence. The sun had begun to dip when a sound drifted from the trees, a long, low call, like a hollow knock, but stretched and mournful. The creature stiffened, pressing itself against the stone, eyes wide with fear. Eli glanced toward the opening. The wind had died. The woods outside were motionless. Then another sound came, A different call, sharper, more rhythmic. It repeated. Then again, from another direction. Eli stepped toward the entrance, heart pounding. "Are they calling you?" he asked, glancing back. The creature, he had begun to think of it as a he, somehow, nodded once. Then his gaze dropped to Eli's backpack. The corner of a photograph peeked from the outer pouch. A small snapshot Eli had kept for years, creased at the edges. Mabel Carver, standing outside the ranger station, smiling beside a group of summer campers. She'd been the only adult who didn't treat Eli like a nuisance when he came around as a kid. The creature's eyes locked onto the photo. His breath caught. He reached a trembling finger toward it. Eli pulled it out, confused. "You know her?" he asked. The creature let out a sound. Not quite a word, but close. A low coo that vibrated in his throat. He touched his own chest, then pointed toward the woods. Eli stared. There was recognition in that sound, not fear, something closer to reverence. "You've seen her before," Eli said, voice hushed. Outside, the wind returned, but the air had changed. The light grew thinner, shadows creeping longer across the leaves. Eli turned to the creature, who was now trying to stand. He moved with effort, pain etched into every motion. Eli moved to help, and the creature let him. "We'll stay here tonight," Eli said, his voice firmer now. "They won't find you here, not yet." He handed over the rest of the water bottle, then dug out a rolled-up thermal blanket from the bottom of his pack. He wrapped it around the creature's shoulders. The fur was coarse, but the way he settled under the warmth was unmistakably human. As darkness folded over the den, Eli listened to the forest breathe. The knocks had stopped, but he knew they would return. And he knew this creature wasn't just hiding. He was being hunted. Eli leaned back against the stone and watched him sleep. For the first time in years, he felt useful. Not pitied, not scolded, needed. The creature had trusted him. In a world where everything else pushed him away, something had chosen to trust him. And somewhere out there, someone, or something, was searching the woods with voices older than language. He closed his eyes, trying to remember how it had felt to belong. This might be the closest thing left. The morning fog had a weight to it, like the forest was holding back breath. Cold clung low to the ground, curling around the base of trees and coiling between branches that hadn't yet dropped their copper-colored leaves. Mabel stood near the tree line, fingers curled loosely around a thermos of black coffee, steam trailing upward as though reluctant to rise. Something had shifted in the woods. She could feel it. Not just in the way birds went quiet or how the deer paths bent differently, but in the pressure behind her eyes, like memory stirring in the deep. It wasn't just the footprints by the creek. It wasn't just the message carved in stone. It was something older. The same something she'd buried in her gut since she was 10. And now, watching the fog snake along the earth like a pale hand reaching, she knew that whatever had once touched her life hadn't finished what it came to do. She didn't tell anyone about what she'd found. No reports filed, no calls to the station. She kept the photograph tucked beneath her coat, and the questions tighter still, folded behind the corners of her mouth when she spoke to the mailman or the checker at the feed store. Some things weren't meant to be said out loud. They were meant to be followed, which was why, just after sunrise, she was hiking again, this time with a quiet edge of purpose in her boots. She moved west, toward the outcropping near Fern Hill where the pines grew closer together and the trail vanished into deer runs. The same direction the stakes had pointed. She told herself she was just checking boundaries. That was the lie she needed to lace her boots. What she didn't expect was to hear a second set of footsteps, light, hesitant, following too far back to be casual. She stopped beside a fallen log and crouched, tying a shoelace that didn't need tying, giving the silence a chance to speak. It did. A twig cracked. She waited. Another breath. Then softly, behind her, "Ms. Carver." She stood fast, turning to find Verna Hayes about 20 feet back, breathless, eyes wide with something like guilt. or maybe fear. "You're following me?" Mabel asked, the edge in her voice sharper than intended. Verna held up both hands. "I'm looking for Eli. I think he's in trouble." Mabel's brow knit. "Your boy?" Verna nodded, stepping closer. "He's been off for weeks, distant, and yesterday I found his backpack hidden under the porch, like he didn't want anyone to know he left. I checked the places near home, but I know he comes out here, to the forest." Mabel frowned, scanning the trees behind Verna, listening. "These woods are too big for guesses." "I know," Verna whispered. "That's why I came. I thought, if anyone knew them like he does, it'd be you." Mabel hesitated, then nodded once. She didn't say it, but something in her gut had already known the boy wasn't far. The trail turned cold, but the feeling stayed. She motioned for Verna to follow, and the two women moved in silence, the kind that came not from distrust, but from the weight of everything neither could say. They passed old birch stands and rotting tree fences, crossed two streams, and entered a part of Elder Hollow that even Mabel hadn't walked in years. The air grew stiller, heavier, as if pressing them to walk softer. Then, ahead, just past a cluster of moss-covered rocks, Mabel spotted the edge of a narrow cave mouth. She motioned for Verna to stay behind and crept forward. Voices, not loud, not clear, but definitely there. Mabel stepped inside, and the world tilted. Eli sat near the back wall, his knees bent, one hand resting gently on something beside him. That something wasn't human. At least, not entirely. Covered in fur, long-limbed, injured. Eyes closed, but chest rising. It wasn't asleep. It was listening. Verna gasped behind her, and the creature stirred. Eli stood quickly. "No, wait! Don't!" But it was too late. The thing jerked upright, letting out a hoarse sound halfway between a groan and a warning. Mabel stepped forward, placing herself between it and Verna, and slowly raised both palms. "It's okay," she said low, steady. "Nobody's here to hurt you." The creature blinked at her, then looked straight into her eyes, and spoke. Not words like a person, but the sound, a name, soft and unmistakable. "Mabel." Her breath caught. The cave blurred for a second. She hadn't heard that voice in nearly 5 decades. Not like that, not this close. The world fell away, just for a moment. She was 10 again, dirt under her fingernails, hanging from a crumbling ledge. The scream stuck in her throat. Then, hands, large, strong, careful, pulling her back. She never saw the face, only the eyes, and the name. Hers. Spoken like a promise. She stared at the creature now. He was older, weathered. But it was him, Roan. He remembered. And somehow, so did she. She dropped to one knee, reaching forward. Her hand met fur, warm and rough and real. Roan didn't flinch. Verna stood frozen, eyes darting from Eli to the thing beside him. What is this?" she whispered. Roan turned to her. His voice was deep, but not cruel. Measured. "Old friend," he said. Then he looked back to Mabel and nodded toward the outside world. His gaze said more than words ever could. "Danger! Time! Urgency!" Mabel helped him rise. His legs shook, but held. Roan motioned for them to follow and led them up the narrow slope behind the cave, into a part of the forest none of them had seen. The trees grew taller here, older, some wide enough to drive a truck through, and there, in the heart of it, sat a circle of stones surrounding a map etched in dirt and bark. Roan knelt, his long fingers tracing the outline of valleys and ridges. He pointed to a mark deep in the hollow. "Timberline," he said. "They take all." Then he tapped another mark, one surrounded by roots drawn in concentric circles. "Heart," he murmured. "Old roots. Long life." Mabel leaned in. "That's the ancient grove," she said. "No trails go that far. No maps have it. It's protected by terrain." Roan looked up, something flickering behind his dark eyes. "They come," he said. Still, the implication was clear. Timberline had found it, or would soon. Mabel's hand clenched. They can't. That grove. Roan nodded. Sacred. Verna stepped forward, quieter now, her fear edged with wonder. How do you speak our language? Roan looked at her, then at Eli. A long time. Listen. He placed a hand over his chest. Not beast, he said softly. Not shadow. Then he looked to Mabel. Memory. The wind picked up, stirring leaves into a spiral before scattering them down again. Eli stood beside the stone map, the photo of Mabel still tucked into his pocket. He's trying to save it, he said. The forest, his family, all of it. Roan reached into a pouch tied at his side and removed something. An old medallion made of wood, carved with swirling lines that wrapped in on themselves like vines. He placed it in Mabel's palm. Yours, he said. You remember. The weight of it was more than wood. It was history, connection, guilt. Because she had forgotten. All these years. And yet he hadn't. She closed her fingers around the token, eyes stinging. Rowan's gaze turned again, sharp now, scanning the canopy. His shoulders stiffened. The message was unspoken, but clear. They were being watched. Somewhere not far, others had heard. The warning had rippled. He looked back once more, and Mabel understood without needing to ask. This was no longer just about memories. It was about choices, and time was running out. She turned to Eli, to Verna, to the place where the earth still held the markings of something older than anything the world above had bothered to notice. The forest didn't forget, and now, neither would they. The snow came early, like a quiet warning, just a dusting at first, brushing the tips of pine needles and settling along the narrow branches like fine salt, but enough to make the wind bite and the world hush. The kind of snow that didn't yet slow the world down, but reminded it to start thinking about the end of things. Roan stood in the clearing beneath the ridge, breath misting from his nostrils in slow clouds, eyes closed, hands pressed into the frozen earth. His fur shimmered with frost, steam rising faintly from his shoulders. He hadn't spoken in hours. Not to Eli, not to Mabel, not even to the younger Bigfoot who had circled the grove, and now sat just beyond the ring of trees, silent, watchful. Rowan wasn't praying. It wasn't worship. It was remembrance. Beneath the dirt here were bones, his ancestors' bones, layered deep in the root beds of trees that had once towered but were now stumps. The stumps were not from time. They were from chainsaws. Mabel stood with her gloved hands tucked under her armpits, trying to absorb the cold without complaint. Beside her, Verna held a notebook, scribbling quietly with fingers turning red. Neither woman spoke. Words didn't belong here. Even the birds had moved elsewhere. What Roan was about to say hadn't been said to humans in generations, and yet he trusted them. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe he simply had no choice anymore. He stood slowly. Snow shook loose from his shoulders. His back cracked faintly. Long ago, Roan said, voice slow like it had been taught to shape each sound carefully. Your kind came with fire. Mabel glanced at Verna, who had stopped writing. Roan walked to the ring of stones and traced a line through the dusting of snow with his finger. Big ones, machines, screamed loud, ate land. Verna opened her mouth to ask something, but Roan raised one hand and she stopped. They came to cut trees, but not just trees. They cut songs, paths, homes, stories. He stepped back and looked at the women with a gaze that did not accuse, but also did not forgive. We remembered you, he said softly. But you forgot us. His eyes rested on Mabel. But I remembered, she whispered. Roan nodded once, then turned away. Your kind were taught, long ago, by us. Mabel furrowed her brow. Taught what? How to live with forest. How to take little. Just enough. How to listen. He reached into a small leather pouch tied around his waist and pulled out a shard of carved wood, weathered, smoothed by time. We gave this to your kind. Long before papers, long before fences, they called it respect. The shard was passed to Verna, whose hands trembled slightly as she held it. "And then?" Mabel asked. Roan looked skyward. "You forgot that word." The trees moaned as a wind swept through them. Snow spiraled upward and then fell in silence. The weight of those words pressed on Mabel's chest like a stone she hadn't realized she'd been carrying her whole life. Verna finally spoke, her voice small. "You said you listened to us over the years?" Roan nodded. "Many winters. We watched, from the ridges, from the mists. You built and broke. You lit and burned. You took more, always more." He paused, and then blamed fire for the ash. Behind them, a branch cracked. Mabel turned to see Hank Raleigh emerging from the trees. His uniform jacket hung open. His breath came fast. He wasn't supposed to be here. Roan's gaze snapped toward him. His body tensed. Not in fear, in grief. "You brought him," Roan said, voice low. "No," Mabel replied. "He followed." Hank raised both hands. "I didn't come to hurt anyone." Roan stepped forward. The younger Bigfoot flanked him now, their heads low, eyes narrowed. Mabel stepped between them. "Wait." Roan pointed at Hank. "He knew." Mabel turned. "What's he talking about?" Hank exhaled like it cost him. "It was a long time ago. I was fresh in the department, out on my own for the first time. I saw one, at dusk, by the old firebreak trail." Verna stepped closer. And I told myself it was a trick of the light. Told my supervisor it was a moose. Told my wife nothing. Told myself every year since that it didn't matter." Roan's eyes never left him. "You chose silence," he said. Hank nodded, ashamed. "I chose my job, my pension, my reputation." Roan stepped back. "Truth costs," he said. Silence held. Then a sound cut through the quiet. A sharp, wet snap. A gunshot. "Close!" Too close. Eli appeared from the lower path, stumbling. "They're near. A group. Hunters. I think they followed the blood trail." Roan spun toward the trees, eyes wild. Then another sound. A cry, thin, high-pitched, pain. Mabel's blood went cold. "Wren." The name left her lips without thinking. They ran, downhill, over the ridge, past frozen creek beds, toward the old elk run where snow had been kicked aside, and a line of red now marked the ground like a thread unraveling. Wren lay half-covered in leaves, chest heaving, one arm curled over his side. Blood soaked his fur. A trapper's bullet had clipped his ribs. Roan dropped beside him with a sound that wasn't human or animal. It was ancient sorrow. Mabel knelt on the other side, pulling off her coat and pressing it into the wound. Her hands shook, but she didn't cry. "He's losing blood fast," she whispered. Verna arrived seconds later, eyes wide. Hank stood further back, gun drawn, eyes on the trees. "There's movement," he said. "2 figures at least, rifles." Roan lifted Wren into his arms. The boy whimpered but did not resist. His eyes found Eli, who stood frozen, jaw clenched. Roan turned to Mabel. "Go." She didn't ask where. She simply nodded. They ran again, this time deeper, into a part of Elder Hollow that hadn't seen human footprints in decades. Roan knew the way. Even carrying Wren, he moved fast, through underbrush, under fallen trunks, past stones etched with forgotten symbols. Finally, they reached a hollow beneath a leaning cedar. Roan laid Wren down. Mabel knelt beside him again, applying pressure, whispering to calm him. Verna lit a match and waved it over the wound, the smoke curling like incense. Roan stood watch. Then turning, he stared into the woods and howled. It wasn't rage, it was summoning. And from the trees, others answered. Shapes, shadows, dozens, maybe more. Bigfoot, silent, solemn, surrounding them. Mabel stepped back, heart racing. Roan raised a hand. "I protect my blood," he said. Then he turned to Mabel. "Do you?" Her voice cracked. "Yes." He nodded. "Then speak for yours, before they forget how." He turned back to the circle, eyes wet. "We once walked beside them," he said in his language. The others bowed. "Now we hide. Now we vanish." But not because we are weak, because we are patient. He looked back at Mabel once more. But patience dies when children bleed. The forest stood still. Mabel felt every bone in her body screaming that this moment mattered more than she could ever say. Then she spoke, not loudly, but with every ounce of truth she had. "We forgot," she said. "We took and never thought about what it cost. But I see you now. I see what we've done. And I swear, I won't stay quiet anymore." Her voice broke, but she didn't look away. "I'm sorry." And then, something happened she couldn't have predicted. She fell to her knees. Not from fear, but from the unbearable knowledge that she had lived a life blind to a world more sacred than she ever dared to imagine. Roan stepped forward. He placed his hand on her shoulder. Warm, heavy, forgiving, but his eyes, still burning, turned toward the dark once more. Others would come, not to listen, but to kill, and the forest had only so much patience left. The ice began to crack before the snow was done. It didn't shatter loudly, just thinned quietly until the edges of things started moving again. The surface of creeks, the joints of wooden bridges, the minds of people who'd long learned how to harden through winter. Spring in Elder Hollow didn't come with flowers. It came with melt. It came with wood smoke shifting direction, with sap rising slow and stubborn in trunks that had stood their ground through storms no newspaper ever mentioned. And this year, spring came with something else too. An ache. A sense that too much had been broken, and not enough had been said about it. Mabel stood by the ranger station bulletin board and stared at the timberline development notice stapled beneath a cheap plastic sheet. The font was too neat, too clean. A new map had been pinned beside it. Bright red zones, surveyor codes, estimated completion dates. There was no mention of ancient roots. No mention of hollowed groves or carved stones or creatures who bled when no one was looking. She tore the paper down and folded it into her coat pocket without a word. Not in anger, not in panic. Just the way someone might press a fallen feather into their journal. Proof that something once flew where others said nothing lived at all. Inside, Verna had spread a dozen student-made posters across the floor, each one clumsy and brilliant in its own way. Marker drawings of trees with faces. Crying owls. A kid had written, "Please don't hurt our forest friends," in thick block letters, every word a different color. Another had painted a mountain with roots shaped like hands. They looked like pleas made by hearts still unbroken by bureaucracy. Verna knelt in the middle of them, her jeans smudged with ink and soil, hair tied back, sleeves rolled high. She looked exhausted in the way only someone fighting for something invisible could ever look. "They want to help," she said quietly. Mabel sat beside her, knees cracking as she folded to the floor. "They will. We've got a few hundred signatures now. That's something." "It is, but not enough." Mabel took a breath, then let it out slow. Truth never starts loud. Verna glanced over. What if it never gets loud enough? They sat in silence a moment longer. Then Mabel stood and went to the filing cabinet where old maps were kept. Maps before timberline, before zoning changes. She pulled one out, unfolded it gently, then flattened it across the desk. Verna rose to look. "That's the old watershed perimeter," Mabel explained, "before the western side dried up from over-harvesting in '94. Verna leaned in. "And here, this is where Roan showed us the heart?" Mabel nodded. "They're right on the edge of it now." Verna stared at the paper like it was a wound. "And the state still greenlighting?" "They think no one's watching, and the people who do watch don't understand what they're seeing." The door opened behind them. Hank stepped in, eyes tired, shoulders heavier than usual. He removed his cap, held it in his hands. "I faxed it," he said. Verna turned. "The internal map?" Hank nodded. "And the falsified soil reports. I had copies from R08 when they did a test drill near Sugar Bend. The numbers don't match the new ones." Mabel stepped closer. "So they faked it?" "Looks that way." Verna gripped the edge of the desk. "That's enough to trigger a state investigation." "If the right people see it," Hank said, "and if we move fast." Mabel's gaze didn't waver. Then we do. She didn't say it, but something in her chest tightened with every beat. Because truth, even when documented, was fragile in the hands of those who benefited from forgetting it. And there were more than just timberline employees sniffing around now. That afternoon, a local news van stopped at the ranger station. A woman with hair too perfect for the weather stepped out, followed by a cameraman whose face held the tired look of someone too used to being ignored. "You're Mabel Carver?" she asked. "I am. We heard you've been collecting stories. About something in the woods?" Mabel narrowed her eyes. "We've been collecting evidence about illegal development, environmental impact, disregard for native growth protections. And the creatures?" Mabel didn't answer. The reporter smiled like she'd already won. "We're doing a weekend piece, maybe something viral." Verna stepped in. "This isn't about virality. It's about preservation." The cameraman looked at Mabel. His eyes weren't mocking, just searching. She stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked back inside without another word. They didn't run the story. But someone else did. A blogger posted a blurry photo of a shadowed figure in the trees near the quarry. The caption read, "Beast or blessing? Is something hiding in Elder Hollow?" It went small-town viral. A few thousand views. Enough for people to start whispering. Enough for danger to wake up. That night, Mabel sat on her porch in silence. A lantern burned beside her. The forest across the road was black, motionless. Then came the knock. Not a hand, not a fist. A stone on stone, the old language. 3 beats. Pause. 1. She stood slowly, stepped into her boots, and crossed the road. The trees parted behind her. Roan stood at the edge of the clearing, taller than she remembered. Shoulders drawn tight. "You should not be seen," Mabel said quietly. He didn't answer. Instead, he held something out to her. A bundle of ferns, twisted into a circle. Inside it, a bone. Small, clean. A message. "They are close," Roan said. "Too close." Mabel swallowed. "Ren?" Roan nodded once. "He's alive, but watched." "By who?" Roan turned toward the west. "Hunger's old ones. Not yours, not mine." She felt the meaning in her spine. Men with motives. Guns without safety switches. Eyes that turned forests into dollar signs. "We're trying," she whispered. Roan stepped closer. "Try louder." Then, without another word, he melted back into the dark. The next morning, Verna's students delivered the letters. Each one handwritten, some barely legible, but everyone real. They stood on the courthouse steps, holding signs drawn with crayons and paint. Hank stood beside them in full uniform. Until he wasn't, he removed his badge in silence, placed it on the courthouse steps, and walked into the crowd. A deputy took photos. Someone shared it online. It caught. The petition hit statewide channels. Local reporters came again. This time, they listened. Mabel received a letter that week. Official stationery. The state was investigating Timberline's permits. They'd bought time. Not forever, but enough. That night, she walked alone to the edge of the grove where she had first seen the stakes curve into a question. She brought with her a candle and an old journal, the one she used to write what she could never say aloud. She placed it on the ground, lit the candle, and whispered, "I didn't forget you." A wind stirred the flame. She wasn't sure if it was the forest answering, or if it simply meant the forest still breathed. Behind her, Verna arrived, holding Ren's hand. He had healed. His arm still bore the scar, but his eyes held no fear. He looked up at Mabel, then placed a stone at her feet. 5 knocks. A beat. 1 more. It was not a goodbye. It was a beginning. And in the darkness, the trees held their breath. Because finally, someone was speaking for them. The rain had come all day, light at first, then heavier as the clouds thickened like wool pulled over the eyes of the valley. By dusk, it had softened again, hanging in the air more than falling, just enough to blur the world. Tree trunks shone dark and wet, and the smell of soaked pine needles drifted through every low place in Elder Hollow. The ground was soft enough that even footfalls from something massive made no sound, just deepened the impressions left behind. And tonight, they gathered, not in anger, not yet, but in ancient custom that carried more weight than any law written in ink. Roan stood at the edge of the gathering ledge, his broad shoulders catching the last of the evening light. Beneath him, the narrow gorge curved like a scar in the earth, and around its rim stood others, dozens. Some taller than Roan, others smaller, with the unmistakable proportions of youth or age. Their fur gleamed in the rain. They didn't speak in any tongue known to humans. They didn't need to. The sound that carried among them came from rocks, tapped gently, rhythmically, passed like a secret from limb to limb. It echoed through stone, through memory, through blood. Mabel stood just beyond the fire line, eyes wide, coat soaked through, heart pounding. Hank stood behind her, still as a shadow. Neither of them had been invited. Not truly. But Roan had looked at them as he entered the gorge, and he had not stopped them. That, in itself, was permission. Eli was already there, crouched low beside Wren, who had been wrapped in long strands of woven bark and moss. The boy's wound had mostly closed, but he moved gingerly, pressing close to Eli's side whenever the others looked his way. Verna knelt a few steps behind, her breath visible in the chilled air, her eyes moving constantly, trying to take in a world she'd never believed she'd witness. Then the knocking stopped. Not because it was finished, but because Roan had raised his hand. The stillness that followed was thick, nearly holy. Roan stepped forward and turned, facing the circle. The words he spoke were not English, not any language that had been charted or reduced to symbols. They came from the throat, from the gut, shaped by history, not grammar. But Mabel could feel their meaning, even if the syllables passed her like wind through trees. One of the older males answered. His voice was harsher, sharper. Another stepped forward, then another. The rhythm changed. What had begun as counsel began to twist into something else. The growls weren't aggressive, not yet, but layered with tension, a challenge, a fracture. Roan raised his voice again, but now others were stepping out from the edges of the circle. Younger, hungrier. They didn't look at the humans like Roan did. They didn't hold understanding in their eyes, only history and loss. Mabel stepped forward, but Hank caught her wrist. "Wait," he said. She shook her head. "They don't want us here," he added. "They need us here," she whispered, and pulled free. Roan's hand went up again. The circle held. Then the challenge came. A tall female with a ridge of gray running along her spine stepped into the ring. She faced Roan. Her hands moved in sharp gestures. Knuckles touched, elbows bent, palms struck the air. Roan responded in kind, quieter, slower. The female turned and pointed, at Hank, at Mabel, at Eli, then to Wren. A low murmur spread through the gathered crowd. Roan stepped between her and Wren. His voice dropped to a low register, nearly inaudible. But Wren whimpered, and Eli stood. "He's scared," Eli said quietly. The female turned toward the boy, her gaze narrowing. Eli didn't flinch. "She's blaming us," he said to Mabel. Mabel nodded. "She wants to strike first," Hank said, "before humans destroy everything." "She sees us as the disease," Verna added. The word hung in the air like smoke. Roan lowered his head, then slowly turned, looking at the humans behind him. He spoke again. Not to them, but about them. The others shifted. Mabel stepped forward. And then she did the only thing she knew might reach them. She dropped to her knees. Mud soaked through her jeans. The wind bit at her skin. She placed one hand flat on the ground, then the other. Lowered her head. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Not for me. For us." The forest listened. "I don't expect forgiveness," she continued. "But I beg for mercy. Not for us. For the child. For Wren. He didn't choose any of this. He's not the one who drills or builds or burns. Neither are we anymore. We came because we saw something worth saving. We stayed because we remembered what it means to belong." Silence. One knock. Then another. Roan stepped forward. He helped her to her feet. The circle didn't break, but something in its center shifted. The tall female lowered her arms, turned away. The challenge had passed. For now. But not all had accepted it. In the far trees, a new movement stirred. Two shapes, cloaked in shadow, stepped beyond the edge. They weren't Bigfoot. They weren't friends. Roan turned, his head snapping in their direction. His nostrils flared. Gunmetal glinted, and the shape of a camera lens caught the firelight. Not just hunters, but those who sold stories. Who sold proof? Who sold wonder? Roan bared his teeth. The fire crackled louder. Hank moved instinctively, stepping forward, shielding Mabel. But it was Wren who moved first. He stood, walked forward, toward Roan, toward the crowd. He looked to the trees and made a sound. A soft, broken cry, but not of fear, of memory, of plea, of warning. The shapes vanished, retreated, but not before the shutter clicked, not before proof was taken. Roan turned. His eyes burned not with anger, but with time, with knowledge of what would follow. Mabel reached for him. "We can stop them," she said. "There are laws, rights." Roan shook his head. "They do not fear laws," he said. "They sell fear." He turned toward the gorge again, then back to Wren, knelt, touched his forehead to the boys, spoke a word only they understood, then stood, faced the circle, faced the humans, then the earth. He lifted his arms. The circle began to drum, not with fists, but with stones. 1, 2, 4, 8. Rhythms ancient and bone deep. Rain fell harder. The forest pulsed with sound. Hank whispered, "What are they doing?" Mabel didn't blink. "They're remembering who they are." The sound rose, echoed into the night. Not rage, but readiness. And the humans stood among them, not as enemies, but as witnesses. For the first time in generations, the forest spoke in full voice, and someone was finally listening. But the knock would not be the last. Others had heard it, and would come. Not all came to kneel. Some came to claim. By mid-July, the air in Elder Hollow didn't move. It just hung, dense and dusty, caught between heat waves and the sound of heavy machinery crawling up from the west slope. Diesel grumbled somewhere near the tree line. The ground shook just enough to make the window glass in the ranger station hum. Mabel sat at her desk, watching a fly crawl across the rim of her coffee cup. She hadn't slept. The stack of reports in front of her was just theater now. Outdated maps, legal arguments, pages of ignored petitions, all paper shields against what was already coming. The letter had arrived that morning. Official suspension. Indefinite pending review. She'd been removed from field responsibilities, effective immediately. No reason listed. No hearing scheduled. Just a single sentence underlined at the bottom. Failure to maintain administrative objectivity. She folded it without blinking, slipped it into the top drawer and closed it gently. Objectivity had gone out the window the day she knelt in the mud beside Roan and felt the forest listen. The sound came again. Engines groaning deeper into timber. They were close now, within hours of the heart grove if they didn't stop. Verna burst through the door without knocking. Her face was flushed, shirt stuck to her back, a clipboard in her hand like it might still change something. "They started," she said. Mabel nodded. "I know. I went to the county office again this morning. They won't return my calls." "They won't. They're stalling until it's done." "Yes." Verna sat hard in the chair across from her. "We have 1,000 signatures now. The petition was picked up by 4 regional news sites. And none of it matters unless someone in that courtroom hears us. They won't. They've already decided." Mabel looked out the window. Verna followed her gaze. "Where's Hank?" she asked. "Gone." "Gone?" "He turned in his badge yesterday." Verna blinked. "What?" "Said if they were going to fire me, they might as well take the last person left who gave a damn." The silence between them was thick and aching. Verna gripped the clipboard tighter. "We can still fight." "We are," Mabel said. "Just not with words anymore." Down the road, the dust kicked up from a passing truck framed the evening like fog. 2 men sat in the back, rifles slung casually over their knees. Not state officers, not conservationists, hired hands, freelancers, people who didn't ask who paid them to guard a construction line as long as the check cleared. Eli watched them from the woods. He crouched behind a deadfall, heart hammering, sweat stinging his eyes. He hadn't told anyone where he'd gone. Not even Wren. The boy was hidden deep, in a place Roan had carved out of the earth long ago. Safe, for now. But Eli had needed to see it, to know what was happening at the edges of the grove. He saw the generator lights flicker. He saw the cleared trees stacked like bodies. He saw the black flag with the timberline emblem flapping like it owned the land. And then he saw the movement, not from the humans, from the forest. They'd come. He felt them before he saw them. Shadows between shadows. Taller than the trucks, slower than the breeze. Eyes glowing faint under the edge of twilight. Not all of them were Roan's people. Not all of them agreed with his way. Eli remembered the ones who had stood across from him at the gorge. The ones who believed hiding was cowardice. And tonight, they weren't hiding anymore. Roan appeared beside him without sound. Eli flinched. Roan didn't look at him, just stared out at the machinery like it was an old enemy whose name he still remembered in his sleep. "They will burn it," he said. Eli swallowed. "Can you stop them?" Roan didn't answer. A low sound began to build. A drumming beneath the ground. Eli could feel it in his teeth, his bones. The others were tapping again. Not with rocks, with fists, with logs, with their own feet against tree trunks, matching a rhythm so old it made the trees themselves shudder. Roan turned to Eli. "Go. I'm not leaving." "Go, tell her. They come. Now." Eli ran. Through the underbrush. Over the slope. Across the shallow ravine. He didn't stop until he reached the station. Mabel met him at the door. He didn't speak. She didn't ask. She just looked into his eyes and nodded. Verna stood, stepping into her boots. "Is it time?" Mabel took the folder from her desk and stuffed it into her coat. "It's past time." They didn't drive. They walked. Because the forest had to see them coming on foot, had to feel every step, had to recognize the ones who still knew how to move without stealing. By the time they reached the western ridge, the air was electric. The first construction tent was already collapsed. No fire, just torn canvas. The second was empty. Then the screams came. Not from the Bigfoot. From the men with guns? Short, frantic, then nothing. Mabel stepped into the clearing and raised both hands. "I'm here," she called. "I'm here for Roan." The air pulsed. Roan emerged from the shadows. His fur matted, hands streaked with mud. Behind him stood 3 of the younger males. The ridge-backed female was among them. She held something, a hard hat, bloodied. Mabel's breath caught. "Stop," she said. "Please, this isn't the way." Roan looked at her, then at the flames rising from the nearest fuel tank, then back. "It was not us," he said. Mabel's stomach turned. "Then who?" A shape emerged from the far tree line, taller than the others, broader, eyes burning. It stepped into the light and the others backed away. Mabel had never seen it before. Roan had. His face shifted, not with fear, but with grief. "Brother," he whispered. The other didn't speak, just stared at the humans like they were nothing but rot. Then he roared. And the forest answered, but not in unity, in chaos. Mabel grabbed Eli's shoulder. "We need to go." Verna stood frozen, eyes locked on the flames. Roan stepped between them and the growing circle of shadows. "Run," he said. "But you—" "Go." And so they ran, down the slope, toward the creek, toward the road. The sky behind them glowed red, and Wren stood on the other side, waiting. Verna dropped to her knees and pulled him close. He didn't ask what had happened. He just whispered, "Are we safe?" And no one answered, because the truth was already burning, and the forest would not sleep again that night. The wind shifted just before the morning fog broke, curling low through the hollows, brushing the tops of cars parked along the state courthouse like smoke off a forgotten fire. The sky was the color of worn paper, clouds thick as if the air itself was holding its breath. Along the sidewalk, children clutched signs they had drawn themselves, some crooked, some too bright, some barely readable. but all real in the way only a child's truth could be. Behind them stood their parents, some in flannel and denim, others in work clothes already marked by grease or sawdust, most with eyes that had forgotten how to hope but still showed up anyway. One voice didn't make a storm, but enough of them gathered and you could feel something shift in the ground beneath your feet. Mabel stood just outside the courthouse steps, her hair pulled back tight, the bruise-colored bags under her eyes softened only by the quiet pride behind them. She didn't carry a speech. She didn't wear a badge anymore. All she had was the folder tucked beneath her arm. The one with the soil reports, the signatures, the map Roan had traced with his finger. Paper carried weight when people believed what was written, but what they needed now couldn't be put in ink. Beside her, Verna knelt beside the youngest students, pinning back a sign that had nearly torn free in the breeze. She smiled at the girl holding it, then stood again, brushing dirt from her knees. "I think they'll listen?" she asked softly. "They have to," Mabel said. "There's no one left to not listen to." The courthouse doors creaked open, and a young clerk stepped out, clipboard in hand, nerves trembling through his pressed sleeves. "They're ready for testimony," he said, barely audible over the shifting feet of the small crowd. Mabel turned once more to the people behind her. Some nodded, others only watched. And somewhere in that silent circle, she swore she could feel Roan's eyes on her again. Not with pressure, but with trust. She stepped inside. The hearing room was too bright. Overhead fluorescents hummed faintly. A panel of 5 sat behind an arched wooden bench. Only one of them looked her in the eye as she approached the microphone. Her boots clicked once, then stopped. She didn't clear her throat, didn't fidget. "My name is Mabel Carver," she said. She waited a beat. Let the quiet stretch long enough for the room to settle. "I worked for the forestry department for 34 years, and I'm here because Elder Hollow is not just a place we manage. It's not a resource. It's not a project. It's a living thing." She spoke about the logging expansion, about the reports Hank had uncovered before they suspended him. She spoke about the manipulation of maps, the erasure of sensitive ecosystems, the communities that relied on those woods for more than just income. She didn't say anything about Roan, or Wren, or the stone circles. Some things weren't for this room, but she did mention what had been seen, heard, remembered. "Some people in this town," she said, "still remember what the old stories warned us about. Not in fear, in reverence. That some things live in the trees that don't want anything from us but to be left in peace." The judges shifted. One frowned, another scribbled. Verna followed with her own statement, her voice steadier than she expected. She read 2 letters from students, one written in blocky crayon script, the other in the shaky cursive of a boy who had stopped speaking at home until the forest gave him a reason to, again. Then Hank stood, not in uniform, just in denim and boots and the weight of a man trying to pay off silence. "They suspended me for giving you the truth," he said. "So now I'm just going to give you more of it, because I don't care about the badge anymore. I care about what's left of that mountain when you're done dragging your machines through it." He laid down copies of the faked environmental reports. He listed the potential for erosion, for water table disruption, for loss of endemic species. He said nothing about the night the fuel tank burned, and neither did anyone else, because some truths weren't theirs to give. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown. Not angry, not loud, just present. The kind of presence that made people in suits sweat for reasons they couldn't quite name. And somewhere, beyond the fields, just out of sight of roads and cameras, the forest moved. Timberline's legal team asked for delay, but the state pressed forward, because a new report had arrived that morning. Geological instability, landslide risk. Someone had submitted evidence anonymously, showing that further excavation would endanger not only the protected routes, but the valley below, including the town itself. The courtroom quieted, the hearing closed, and 3 days later, the decision came. Termination of Timberline's project permit. Immediate investigation of fraudulent documentation. A halt to all development in the Elder Hollow region pending comprehensive review. There were no cheers, just exhaled breath. like something old had been holding tight for too long. That night, Mabel returned to the grove, alone. The leaves had begun to turn again, early this year. The sky hung low. She stood at the place where Roan had once stepped between her and the ridge-backed female, where the stones had been placed long before her memory began. She removed the wooden token he had once given her and pressed it into the soil. Then she waited. The forest didn't rush. It never had. But when she turned to leave, something heavy settled in her palm. She didn't remember reaching down. But there it was. A seed. Not just any seed. Thick, ribbed, dark as old ash. It pulsed faintly in her fingers like it remembered a rhythm older than rain. She took it home without question, and the next morning, she returned to the cliff where, decades ago, a small hand had once slipped and been caught by something larger than life. She knelt, dug gently, planted it in the same soil where her memory had once been pulled back from the edge, and as the wind brushed past her shoulders, she swore she felt warmth. Not sun, not breeze. A hand, just for a second. Then gone. From the ridgeline, Eli watched without calling out. Wren sat beside him, legs crossed, eyes closed. He reached for Eli's hand and held it, not like a child, but like someone who knew the cost of being saved. And far off in the trees, just beyond where roads dared go, Roan stepped back into shadow, a hand resting on the bark of a tree that had never been named by men. He watched until the wind shifted, then turned and disappeared. Nothing was said in the newspapers about the real reasons. Nothing needed to be, because the forest had been heard, and that was all it ever asked for. There were no statues built, no plaques nailed to trees, only the memory, only the seed, only the sound of something old beginning again, soft as footsteps, slow as trust. But there, still there, for those who still listen. There are places in this world that still remember, not because they were never touched by time, but because time itself moved more gently through them, quiet, slow, deliberate, like breath through pine, like light on water. These places don't shout, they don't plead, but they wait, and when the right hearts arrive, they open. Some stories were never meant to be solved, only respected. Some truths don't fit inside books or courtrooms. They live in the hush of the trees, in the rhythm of knocking stones, in the way a stranger becomes part of your home without ever speaking a word. Not all answers need language. Sometimes they just need listening. And in a world that often forgets how to slow down, how to look deeper, how to honor silence, these stories become something more than folklore. They become reminders that we are not alone, that being lost doesn't mean being forsaken, that even the oldest wounds can soften when touched by kindness, that maybe the most powerful things don't ask to be seen. They just ask to be left in peace. Because what matters most isn't whether you believe every piece of the tale. What matters is what it stirred in you. If it reminded you of something you thought you'd forgotten, if it made you pause long enough to wonder, if it pulled a thread of memory or longing or hope from somewhere deep in your chest and said, "You're still here. You still care. You're still listening." And that's enough. That's how stories like this survive, not in the shouting, but in the passing on. So, wherever you're watching from, whether it's a quiet town tucked in the hills or a noisy city wrapped in glass, thank you for spending this time here. Thank you for believing in something bigger than explanation. Thank you for listening with your heart. We'd love to know where this story found you. Was it a memory? A place? A feeling you didn't expect? Tell us in the comments below. Share your name, your corner of the world, or just one word that this story left behind in you. And if this journey moved you, if it reminded you of the beauty in the unknown, we invite you to like, subscribe, and join our growing community of hearts who believe that somewhere out there, the forest still remembers. Until next time, keep your fire warm, keep your soul soft, and above all, keep listening.